Now, whenever we create a variable, there is going to be some name associated with that variable. We call this name an identifier. Now, we've seen identifiers in other programming languages. We talked about it in Java in CS 121. Now, identifiers are not just for variables. They can be used for several things as well. In fact, they're used for variables, they're used for control names, class names, method names, and so forth. But it's a way to uniquely identify some item in our code. So here for variables, the identifier allows us to identify a specific variable. If we're dealing with classes, we can use identifiers to uniquely identify a particular class. Now, there are some rules as far as what an identifier can have and cannot have. So identifiers are allowed to have letters, whether they're uppercase letters or lowercase letters, doesn't matter, but we're allowed to have letters in our identifier. We're allowed to have underscores, and we're allowed to have numbers. The big thing that it cannot have is, well, anything else. No other characters are allowed. We're only allowed to have letters, underscores, and numbers. This also includes spaces. We cannot have a space in an identifier. If you're trying to take like two words together and put them together to use an identifier, you'd either need to do some tricks with capitalization letters like in Java, or use an underscore to separate them, but you're not allowed to have a space in an identifier. The other rule with identifiers is that it must begin with a character or the underscore. We cannot have it start with a number. And this is true for identifiers in any other programming language. Let's do an exercise just to make sure you understand the rules as far as what is a valid identifier and what is not. So here I have a bunch of identifiers. Some of them are valid, some of them are not. And I'm going to ask you to pause the video and make a note of which of these identifiers are valid and which ones are invalid. So pause the video for just a second, and then when you're done, resume it, and we'll go over each of these to let you know which ones are valid and which ones are invalid. The identifier for first name is valid because every single character in here is a letter, whether it's uppercase or lowercase. We only have one uppercase letter, the N for name, but everything else is a lowercase letter. So this is a perfectly valid identifier. One name is not a valid identifier, and that's because it starts with a number. So our rule is that identifiers can only start with letters or an underscore. So since this starts with a number, this is not a valid identifier. Now, name 1 is a valid identifier, and that's because it starts with a capital letter, so that's perfectly fine. And then we have a bunch of other letters, and then we end with a number. So letters and numbers are perfectly valid characters for an identifier. Pay underscore rate is also a valid identifier. All of the characters here are either lowercase letters or underscores. These are all valid characters for identifiers. Therefore, we have a valid identifier. Amount with a $sign at the end is not a valid identifier. And that's because we have the $sign character in here, which is not a valid character for identifiers. Therefore, this is no go. Now, if we took out the $sign and just had amount, that would be valid. But if we include an invalid character, then the identifier is not valid. Pay rate with a space is also invalid. So we had pay rate before with an underscore. Underscores are valid characters, but here we have a space, and we explicitly said that spaces are not valid characters for identifiers. We're not allowed to have spaces. Now, if we combine this into one word, that would be valid, but just having pay rate with a space is not a valid identifier. In fact, here you would have to treat pay and rate as two separate identifiers to make them valid. The character X by itself is a perfectly valid identifier. There's no rule that says that an identifier has to have so many characters. The only rule is that it starts with an underscore or a letter of some fashion, but a single character is a perfectly valid identifier. AAAA is also a valid identifier. Our rule is just that we have to have letters, numbers, or an underscore. And here we have just a bunch of letters. They just happen to be all the same letter. So this is a perfectly valid identifier. A1123 is also valid. Going back to our rule that as long as it starts with a letter or an underscore, and then the remaining characters are letters, underscores, or numbers, we're good to go. So here we have a lowercase letter to start our identifier, and then we have a bunch of numbers afterwards. Therefore, this is a valid identifier. Now, underscore P underscore 1 is also valid because it does start with an underscore, which is perfectly fine for identifiers. And we never said there has to be just one underscore. We can have as many underscores as we want. So having P underscore 1 following is perfectly fine because we have lowercase letters, or just letters in general, numbers and underscores. So therefore, this is a valid identifier. Fifth, num is not a valid identifier, and that's because it starts with a number. Remember, our rule is that our identifier has to start with either a letter, whether it's uppercase or lowercase, or an underscore. It cannot start with a number. And since this starts with the number 5, this is not a valid identifier. Now, it may come as a shock to you, but valid identifier with a space is not a valid identifier. That's because we have the space. As we mentioned before, spaces are not allowed in identifiers. So therefore, valid space identifier is invalid. If we wanted to make this valid, we can either close up the space or we can replace the space with an underscore. But if we include spaces, doesn't matter what the rest of the identifier has, it's not valid.